So today we're going to be talking about persecution in the church in the early second century. And so with that, with the early second century persecution, it's not the idea that Christians everywhere were being brutally uh, terrorized, persecuted, beat down. Um, in many places, Christians did live in peace with Rome. They lived at peace with the villages and the towns that they were living in. Um, but that's not the same case for all believers. That's not the same case for all Christians. Not all of them got to live peaceably. There were some who were persecuted. But I don't want you to think this isn't the mass, widespread persecution of all Christians in the early second century. It starts out pretty locally. And so, what we have in the second century is the situation where the Christians are not fitting in to the Roman religion. They weren't fitting in with their civil society. What you see, or what we have a record of, is a story between Pliny. Pliny was a governor of Bithynia, and he was a Roman governor. And what happens in the second century, in the accounts that we have, is that Pliny uh, came to Bithynia and started having town hall meetings with different villages, essentially. And then someone raised the question of the people who met in secret to overthrow the government. There were stories of this group of people who met secretly. Their goal was to overthrow the government, and the way they want to do that, and they went by the name of Christians. And so Pliny asked, what's going on here? What's going on? And the people essentially said that they weren't worshiping the gods of the empire. They weren't worshiping the gods of the empire. And so we don't know exactly, we don't know the exact problem that the citizens of Bithynia had with other believers, or not with other believers, but with Christians at that time. We don't know the exact problem they had, but it's believed that businesses were suffering. That businesses were suffering in Bithynia because people stopped making sacrifices. The Christian presence and influence was so great that it was starting to hurt the marketplace. It started to hurt businessmen. They weren't going to the people there weren't making as many sacrifices as they were before, and thus it disrupted people's livelihood, and it disrupted, excuse me, rather I'd say, it disrupted the culture in general. And so uh, with that, and we get that because we do have excerpts from Pliny where he wrote that the flesh of sacrificial victims is on sale everywhere, though up till recently scarcely anyone could be found to buy it. And so that's we have that writing from Pliny in one of his letters. And so what appears to be happening is that the Christians, weren't buying the sacrificial meat, and so it was hurting the businessmen. There was plenty of stuff to be bought for sacrifice, but no one was found to buy it. You see, the Rome was very religious. Roman society was very religious. The empire was very religious, and their civil living was tied to their religion. It's called a civil religion. And so for us today, an example of this would be a prayer at a football game, or it may be saying the Pledge of Allegiance at church during a vacation Bible school or something like that. And so if you didn't participate in the religion, you weren't patriotic. And so it would be kind of like the American South in the 1950s and 60s. Everyone was a Christian. You had this cultural Christianity. You had this civil religion where kind of the de facto God is the Christian God. And so for the Romans, they were very religious. They had their gods. It was a part of their life. It was part of civil society, and so uh, that's where early Christians found themselves all of a sudden worshiping a different God than the God of the empire, and so the Christians at that time, they weren't participating in the civil religion. They weren't participating in what was going on. And not only were they not participating, but they were trying to get other people to stop sacrificing in the civil religion as well. So you had Christians meeting together. They weren't doing the sacrificial offerings, and they were also trying to stop other people from doing it as well. They were really disrupting the civil society, the civil religion. They were just disrupting the marketplace and what was going on there. And so what the Christians were doing was meeting together and talking about belonging to another race, talking about being a separate people, talking about another kingdom. They came together and discussed those things. And so because of this, the Romans had reason to be fearful. The Romans didn't hate Jesus, but they were fearful of the Christians because of the message that they were spreading, being a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a called out people, etc. And so this would really shake things up. That's why the Romans were fearful of them and what was going on from them. They didn't hate Jesus. They weren't against Jesus. They weren't against Jesus, but what they were fearful of was the message that Christians were spreading of being a separated, called out different people. So then Pliny writes to Trajan, who was the Roman emperor from roughly 98 AD to 117 AD. And he writes to them to find out what to do with these people. You have this group of people that's talking about this. Rumor says this about them. What do you want me to do? You're the emperor. Tell me what to do. And Trajan, he responds that they can worship whoever they want as long as it didn't detract from being a part of Roman society. So what he was saying was that you can still worship your own God, but you got to go to the temple and participate in Rome's civil religion as well. Okay? He was saying you can't worship Jesus. He wasn't saying you can't worship God. You can do that, but you also have to do this. You have to belong and participate in the Roman civil religion. And so in response to this, the Christians pushed back. They looked at Scripture and they saw how others were willing to disobey the government in order to properly worship God. For example, they looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from Daniel 3. And in the notes, you'll find that I included this story in the lecture. I want us to read it together. So we have a refresh ourselves of what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was facing. It says, "Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.' Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, so they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, 'Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?' Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.' Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind them, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast three men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see four men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps and the prefects, the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. You see, the Christians, they looked to this story, they turned to this story, and they saw that it was okay to defy the king when the king was wanting them to worship a golden calf or a golden image, when they saw that the king wanted them to disobey their faith. And so these three boys saw that bowing down to a golden image would violate the right exercise of their faith. So the Christians during this time, they know this story, and therefore they did the same thing. The Christians saw that what they were doing was a spiritual thing, and that because they were still forced to go to the temple, etc., that their faith was being challenged. And so the Christians didn't obey Trajan. They didn't continue to go to the temple. They didn't make those sacrifices. They realized that if they were to go worship other gods, they would be violating what their own faith says for them to do. And so Trajan's order resulted that Christians should be punished because they wouldn't obey the command of the emperor. After some Christians were thrown into jail, other Christians really start to push back by publicly living out their faith. And eventually what you end up getting is that anyone who is perceived to be a threat gets put in jail, gets persecuted. They end up getting persecuted. So what's important to note here is that the Romans were not asking the Christians to give up the gospel. They just wanted them to be patriotic as well. You can still have Jesus, you can still have the gospel, you can still have the scriptures, but you need to be patriotic as well. Again, they didn't hate Jesus. The Christians could have Jesus, they could worship Jesus, but they needed to do other things as well to be good citizens, to be Roman citizens, to be patriotic, to continue to be a part of society. Because what the Romans wanted to do is they want to preserve the ancient greatness of Rome. That is, they want to preserve the values, the customs, the traditions of Rome, and that was found in religion. They esteemed morality even if they didn't practice it. And so, with that, again, the goal of the Romans was to preserve, and they had this ideal of ancient Rome, and all the ideals and morals and customs that went with that. They want to preserve that, and that was found in religion. And so with Christians coming in and no longer participating in that, they were going against the goal of Rome. They were going against the goals of the emperor. And so and with that, they esteemed morality. The Romans esteemed morality. For them, morality was important, and even if they didn't practice it themselves. And so the Romans didn't think that the Christians were moral. Okay, this ties into This ties into Christians being persecuted. The Romans didn't think that Christians were moral. They accused Christians of destroying the family unit. And if you look at the call of Christ, that can happen. That can happen. And so Christians, but suffered in part because of rumors. Okay, Christians during that time were being accused of having love feasts with brothers and sisters. And now, in reality, the true Christians were celebrating the Lord's Supper, but due to the rumors, Romans thought that they were having orgies. To be honest, they thought they were having orgies, and so they thought that Christians would put a lamp on a stand, that they would tie a dog to the stand, and then they would get the dog to run, thus knocking over the light. And when the light went out, they got to have sex with anyone, man, woman, child, wife, whoever. And so, because of these rumors, the Romans didn't think that Christians were moral. Again, now, real Christians were celebrating a genuine Lord's Supper with their brothers and sisters, like we practice today. But what was going on was these stories of this immorality during these love feasts, or that they were sacrificing babies and those kinds of things. So one letter comes from a Christian author, and I want to read it to you. It's somewhat graphic, but I think it's important, and we're all old enough to understand this, and to handle these subject matters, but it's important to read these stories because it just tells of how prolific and grotesque some of these rumors were. And so this one letter says that when they thus ate together, and so to speak, filled up their veins from the surplus of their strength, they turned to excitements. The man, leaving his wife, says to his own wife, "Stand up and perform the agape with the brother." Then the unfortunates unite with each other, and as I am truly ashamed to say the shameful things that are being done by them, because according to the holy apostle, the things that are happening by them are shameful even to mention. Nevertheless, I will not be ashamed to say those things which they are not ashamed to do, in order that I may cause in every way a horror in those who hear about their shameful practices. After they have had intercourse in the passion of fornication, they raise their own blasphemy to heaven. The woman and the man take the fluid of the emission of the man into their hands. They stand, turned toward heaven, their hands besmeared with the uncleanness, and pray as people called stratotokoi and gnostikoi, bringing to the Father the nature of all that which they have on their hands, and they say, "We offer to thee this gift, the body of Christ." And then they eat it, their own ugliness, and say, "This is the body of Christ, and this is the Passover, for the sake of which our bodies suffer and are forced to confess the suffering of Christ." Similarly, also, with a woman, when she happens to be in the flowing of the blood, they gather the blood of menstruation of her uncleanness and eat it together and say, "This is the blood of Christ." And so there are pretty nasty and disgusting rumors going on about Christians and what they practice. And so because of stories like this, and because it's being circulated, it became a stereotype of what Christians did. Rumors of what fringe Christians groups did became a stereotype for all believers. Thus, Romans had a misperception that of what Christianity and what Christians was about. And so it led them to think that these are very immoral people. And so, again, there were some fringe Christian groups, where there's evidence that they did participate in things. But we know that is not the Christian faith. That is not the Christian message. And so you had people who had to write out against this. And so, but again, because rumors tend to spread and stories tend to spread, they become stereotypical of all believers, of all Christians that fall under that category, when we know today that is not the case. And so the Christians and Romans had the same picture of what society should look like. Don't steal, those kinds of things. Again, Romans may not have always practiced morality, but they did uphold it. And while they had the same ideal for society, the Christians went on to say that there is more, like how the world was created. And now we're going to get into some of the early defenders of the faith. Okay, specifically, we're going to be talking about Justin Martyr, and we're going to be talking about Irenaeus of Lyons. And so, with this, Christians, Romans, they had the same ideal for society. Following the Ten Commandments, if you will, don't steal, don't commit adultery, those kinds of things. And so they had the same ideal, the similar ideal. And so, but the Christian faith, the Christian message went on to say that there was a creation, okay, and there was a different creation than what the Romans believed happened. And so, in telling this story of creation, you see this in the works of Justin Martyr. Justin was a martyr. Martyr isn't his last name, but Justin was a martyr, and he lived from roughly 100 AD to 168 AD. And his most famous works are his first and second apology and his dialogue with Trypho. And so in these works, Justin is explaining the faith, and he does this in a couple of different ways. In his apologies, he is writing to the Roman emperor. In his first apology, he's writing to the Roman emperor. And in his second apology, he's writing to the Roman Senate. And in these apologies, he's telling them the Christian story from Genesis through the resurrection without quoting scripture. Okay? And he did this because the Romans, they didn't have the Bible. They didn't have the scriptures. They didn't know these. They wouldn't know these references they would refer to. And so Justin is telling the gospel story to people who don't have any of the story to begin with. And he's telling it from creation all the way through. And so he's doing what Paul did in Acts 17. The Romans had the wrong story, and Justin was writing to correct that. They had the wrong gospel story, and Justin was writing to correct that. Now, in his dialogue with Trypho, he did use the Bible. Trypho knows the facts of the story, but he didn't understand the story correctly. Trypho had the right story, but the wrong interpretation. He had a misunderstanding of the Bible. Now, the identity of Trypho is unknown. Some think he was a Jewish rabbi named Tarphon, while others think that Trypho is made up in order for Justin to achieve his purpose in writing. Either way, what we have here is the accounts of Christians explaining the story of real reality. That's what we have here. We have them telling the story, telling the gospel message, and defending a gospel message to unbelievers, to those who don't know the story, or to those who don't have a right understanding of the story. And so he's using whatever tools, he's using whatever methods he could to communicate that right and true method. And so Justin Martyr is an important guy in the story of Christianity. Now, the church fathers were not perfect. They weren't infallible interpreters. What they were people who had to think about their theology because they had to defend it. And so they don't have what we have. Right now, we get to be the beneficiaries of 2,000 years worth of theological thought, argument, training, teaching. We get the benefit. We get the fruits of their labor. They did not have that. They had to think about why they did what they did, or how they should do certain things. An example of this is nude baptism. Christians being baptized during this time used to be baptized in the nude. Why? Why did they do this? Why would they be baptized naked? Because Jesus was on the cross. There was nothing more shameful than that an innocent man was forced to suffer for the guilt of sin for all. So they were baptized in the nude because they should be ashamed of their sin. They should be ashamed of their sin. And so, and they thought the best way to display that, to show that, to display it, is by being baptized in the nude, because it's shameful. Unless you're with your spouse, nudity is shameful. And so they had to really think about what they believed. They had to really think about what they believed, and as they were thinking about the faith and trying to, they were thinking about the faith and trying to put it into practice correctly. Uh, they want to think rightly. They want to practice it rightly. They just want to live out their faith rightly. And so, along these lines, we get another church father named Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus was born in the early 2nd century, and he lived until roughly 202 AD. He was a bishop in what's now known as France. And so he is known for 2 works, Against Heresies and the Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching. Against Heresies and the Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching. So, in the demonstration of apostolic preaching, what Irenaeus seeks to do is give an explanation of how the Old Testament talks or predicts Jesus. It was apostolic preaching of Christ in the Old Testament. It was helping people to see Christ according to the Old Testament. And that is what that work was about. That was its point and its purpose. Against heresies is probably more important historically. When I said that they really had to think about their faith, I really meant to. I want to show you Irenaeus' work Against Heresies. It's a pretty thick book. And so in this book, he's arguing against 2 faulty beliefs, Marcionism and Gnosticism. And so, this isn't a lot of commentary from modern authors. This is, all of this is Irenaeus' work. And so historically, this is more significant. Again, Irenaeus Against Heresies, it's a huge work, but it's vastly important. And so if you ever have any time to read it, you should. So like I said, with this, Against Heresies, Irenaeus is arguing against Marcionism, and he is arguing against Gnosticism. And so Marcionism was started by Marcion. He lived from roughly 84 AD to about 160 AD. And he was excommunicated from the church roughly 144 AD. But his teachings lasted for a while longer. In short, Marcionism says that Jesus is the true Savior sent by the true good God. He said that the God of the Old Testament was a mean God and not the real one true God. He says that the God in the Old Testament must not be the Christian God, and that Jesus essentially started a new religion. The Christian God was not the God of the Old Testament, so in response to this, in response to Marcion claiming that the God of the Old Testament and the Christian God are 2 different gods, that it's not the same, Irenaeus says that Marcion isn't Christian. He's not Christian because, again, our definition of Christianity is, clinging to the teachings of the apostles. And so Marcion isn't Christian because he doesn't follow the apostolic preaching. Okay? And so he says that Marcion doesn't have the real gospel, because the gospel message we get is the one that's handed down to us. He says Marcion does not have that because what our gospel is Christ according to the Old Testament. If he used to say that's a different God than Jesus and the God who sent him, well, then that's not Christian, because that's not what the apostles taught. And Christianity started with the teaching of the apostles. Okay, then the other group, the second part of this work, argues against Gnosticism. He argues against the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics sought to explain an infinitely good God and an infinitely bad creation. They saw things in terms of good and evil, light and darkness. And so their message was dangerous because it could undermine Christianity, because they would say, why would a good God allow it? Why would a good God allow this evil creation, this bad stuff? And so their answer to that was that there's God, a God of pure goodness, purely spiritually, 100% light, 100% good, and this God is far off from creation. They also believe that there's creation, there's a material world, and this material world is evil, it's dark, it's 100% not good. It's total darkness. And so, what they contend is that God had emanated a demigod, and this demigod is only 99% good. Okay, so then another emanates, and it's only 98% good. Essentially, as one is emanated, the amount of goodness in that demigod decreases. So you eventually get a demigod that's only 1% good, and this is the God you get in Genesis. And I made this little drawing to try and help explain that. So you start off with God who's 100% good, light, he's spiritual, and this God emanates a demigod, and that demigod is only 99% good. Then another, only 98. Another, you get 75. And then you eventually get to a demigod who's only 1% good, and that's the God of Genesis. They see the material world as inherently bad. You see creation at the bottom, total darkness, evil, material, 100% or 0% not good. I think the note says, and the drawing says 0% good, and then that's the case, not good. And so when they say is that when a demigod is birthed, what flies out are souls. Okay, and the bad part happens when a soul gets trapped in an evil, mortal body. Again, all creation, all material things is bad and evil. And so the goal of redemption then is to get back to heaven. But to get back to heaven, you need a password. You need the right thing to say. And so the Logos, as Jesus, came to earth to share the password. The Word came down from heaven to share the password. And so the Logos really wasn't human because then he would be evil. So again, the Logos that came down from heaven was purely spiritual, denied the incarnation of Christ. The Logos wasn't really human because then he would be evil. They say that the apostles messed up the message. And now only the Gnostics know how to get it back. Only the Gnostics know how to get people back to heaven. So the Gnostics think they have this greater spiritual message. And Irenaeus says in response that no, God reveals himself through the text. And so for the Gnostics, salvation is purely spiritual. But the Christian gospel is that there's a bodily resurrection. Okay? And so that's what Irenaeus is arguing against the Gnostics, is that the Gnostics, they say that the apostles messed up the message, and that the Logos gave a password, and we know it. We know the way back to heaven. But again, that's not Christian. That these people claim to be Christians, but their message is not Christian because, again, this is why we emphasized last week's lecture so much, that Christianity begins with the teachings of the apostles. Because here we have Gnostics and Marcion who are going off making up their own thing, okay, and saying this, now there's multiple demigods, and there's light, there's dark, and there's all this, and so that's why we emphasized at the start of class last week that Christianity started with the teachings of the apostles. Okay, if you start with that, if you hold on to that, that's the Christian message. Okay, these various heresies, claiming to be, Christian, they're not Christian, because to be Christian means to hold on to the teaching of the apostles and so when you deny that teaching, when you say that's wrong, then it's no longer Christian. Okay, and so it's important for us to remember that we cling to the teaching of the apostles. The Christian faith comes from the teaching of what the apostles say, and what they say is Christ according to the Old Testament, and that's what their writings testify to, that the Christ prophesied in the Old Testament is the Jesus who came and walked this earth. And so that's going to wrap up today's lecture. Like I said, your assignment to count attendance is to post on the discussion board. It's going to the discussion question is to for you to share an insight that you learned from today's lecture, or to post a question from today's lecture. And when we meet again, we'll provide some clarity on that again. So the discussion question is going to be to post a question from that you thought of from today's lecture, or to share an insight that you had from today's lecture. And I'll put the timeline on when that's due. We'll put it on. I'll put it on Populi. Okay. If y'all have any questions, feel free to email me, call me, text me. Thank you so much for your prayers. Me and my family would greatly appreciate it. Hope you all have a blessed weekend, good rest of the week, and a good start to the week next weekend. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.